The stagecoach deposited Victoria Vaughn at the edge of Shoshone, Idaho Territory, on a blistering August afternoon in 1878, and she stumbled onto the dusty main street with nothing but a carpet bag, bruised ribs, and eyes that had forgotten how to trust the world. The driver didn't wait for payment because her husband's brother had already settled the fare back in St. Louis, eager to be rid of the woman who'd brought shame to their family by surviving when perhaps it would have been more convenient if she hadn't. Victoria stood there as the coach rattled away, feeling the weight of every mile she'd traveled, every compromise she'd made, every night she'd lain awake wondering if the next blow would be the one that finally killed her. The main street of Shoshone stretched before her like a promise she didn't dare believe in. False-fronted buildings lined both sides, their paint peeling under the relentless sun. A saloon pumped tinny piano music into the afternoon heat. Men in dusty clothes moved with purpose or lounged in whatever shade they could find. Women in practical dresses hurried between the general store and the boarding house. No one looked at her twice, which suited Victoria just fine. She'd had enough of being looked at, evaluated, found wanting. She needed work. She needed a place to sleep. She needed to disappear into the kind of life where no one asked questions about the fading yellow bruise on her cheekbone, or why a woman of 24 traveled alone with so little to her name. The boarding house seemed the logical place to start. A weathered sign proclaimed it Mrs. Henderson's respectable rooms. Victoria climbed the 3 steps to the porch, her ribs protesting with each movement, and knocked on the door frame. A woman in her 50s appeared, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind. "Help you? I'm looking for a room," Victoria said, keeping her voice steady. "And work, if you know of any." Mrs. Henderson looked her over with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of women arrive in Shoshone running from something. "Got a room. $3 a week, breakfast included. As for work, the restaurant 2 doors down needs a waitress. Martha's getting too old to manage the supper rush alone." "I can do that." Victoria had done worse. Much worse. "You got a husband following you here?" The question was blunt but necessary. Victoria met the older woman's gaze. "I had a husband. He died 6 months ago." The lie came easier than the truth, which was that she'd left him bleeding on the kitchen floor after he'd tried to crack her skull open with a whiskey bottle, and she'd finally fought back with the cast iron skillet. She'd run that same night, and his brother had helped her disappear, not out of kindness but because the scandal would have ruined the family's standing. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. "That bruise on your face doesn't look 6 months old." "Got jostled on the stage," Victoria said. Another lie, but this one transparent enough that Mrs. Henderson would understand what wasn't being said. "Rooms upstairs, 2nd door on the right. You can pay weekly. Go see Martha at the restaurant. Tell her I sent you." Mrs. Henderson turned to go, then paused. "This is a decent town, miss." "Vaughn. Victoria Vaughn, Mrs. Henderson. This is a decent town, Victoria. You'll be safe here." Victoria wanted to believe her, but safety was a concept she'd lost faith in long ago. The room was small but clean, with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the back lots where chickens scratched in the dirt. Victoria set down her carpetbag and sat carefully on the edge of the bed, her ribs aching. She'd cracked them 2 weeks ago when Thomas had kicked her for burning the roast. They were healing, but slowly, and every breath reminded her of how close she'd come to never breathing again. She gave herself 5 minutes to sit in the silence of that small room. 5 minutes to acknowledge how far she'd traveled and how utterly alone she was in the world. Then she stood, smoothed her travel-stained dress, and went to find Martha's restaurant. The restaurant occupied a narrow building between the general store and a land office. The smell of frying meat and fresh bread made Victoria's stomach clench with hunger. She'd eaten sparingly on the journey west, conserving her small stash of coins. Inside, a handful of men sat at tables covered with red checked cloths. An older woman with silver hair pinned in a bun moved between them with a coffee pot, refilling cups with practiced efficiency. She looked up when Victoria entered. "We're still serving if you're hungry," Martha said. "Mrs. Henderson sent me. She said you might need help." Martha's weathered face brightened. "You have waitressing experience. I can learn quickly. Can you carry plates without dropping them and smile at men even when they're being fools?" "Yes, madam. You're hired. $1 a day plus whatever tips you can charm out of the customers. We serve breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, and supper from 5 to 8. Can you start tomorrow?" Victoria's relief must have shown on her face because Martha smiled. "Or you can start now if you're hungry. I'll feed you and you can watch how things work." "Thank you," Victoria said, and meant it more than Martha could possibly know. The first few days in Shoshone passed in a blur of learning. Victoria learned the rhythm of the restaurant, the names of the regular customers, the way to balance 3 plates at once without straining her still-healing ribs. She learned which men tipped well, and which ones tried to grab her waist when she passed. She learned how to sidestep and smile and keep moving, how to be friendly without being available, how to exist in a space without drawing too much attention. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was quiet and clean. The other residents were a mining surveyor, a widow who taught at the small schoolhouse, and a telegraph operator. They nodded to Victoria in the hallways but didn't pry into her business. She ate her breakfasts quickly and spent her evenings in her room, listening to the sounds of the town settling into night. She hadn't come to Shoshone looking for healing. She'd come looking for escape, for anonymity, for a place where she could simply exist without fear. But something about the clear Idaho air, the way the mountains rose purple and massive in the distance, the simple routine of honest work and exhausted sleep, began to work on her like water on stone. She'd been in Shoshone for 2 weeks when she first saw Morgan Ashford. The restaurant was crowded with the dinner rush, every table full of miners, ranchers, and townsmen hungry for Martha's pot roast and potatoes. Victoria moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, her arms loaded with plates, her face fixed in the pleasant, neutral expression she'd perfected. She was heading back to the kitchen when the door opened and a man stepped inside. He was tall, probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of weathered denim. He wore range clothes, dusty from riding, and moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. But it was his eyes that caught Victoria's attention, the way they held a loneliness so profound it was like looking into a mirror. He took a table in the corner, removed his hat, and sat with his back to the wall. Victoria grabbed a coffee pot and approached. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." His voice was quiet, rough from disuse. She poured, noting the way he kept space between them, the way he didn't let his eyes linger on her face or body. Some men looked at her with hunger or speculation. This man looked at her like she was a person who happened to be holding a coffee pot. "Martha's got pot roast tonight, or there's ham with beans. The pot roast sounds fine." Victoria nodded and turned to go, but he spoke again. "You're new in town." It wasn't quite a question, but she answered anyway. "About 2 weeks now. How are you finding Shoshone?" "It's quiet," she said, which was the highest compliment she could give. Something flickered in his eyes, understanding maybe, or recognition. Quiet's good sometimes. She brought him his pot roast and he ate in silence, reading a week-old newspaper someone had left behind. He was still there when the rush cleared, nursing his coffee and watching the street through the window. When he finally stood to leave, he placed exact change on the table plus a generous tip. "Thank you for the meal," he said, meeting her eyes briefly. "I'm Morgan Ashford. I've got a horse ranch about 5 miles north of town." "Victoria Vaughn." He nodded, settled his hat on his head, and left. Victoria cleared his table, pocketing the coins, and wondered why a simple exchange with a quiet rancher had left her feeling less alone than she had in months. Morgan Ashford came to the restaurant 3 times a week, always taking the same corner table, always ordering whatever Martha had made that day. He didn't talk much, but he was unfailingly polite, and he left good tips. After his 3rd visit, Martha mentioned that he'd been running his ranch alone since his father died 2 years back. "Sad business, that," Martha said, rolling out pie dough. "His mother passed when he was just a boy, and his father was a hard man. Morgan worked that ranch from dawn to dusk his whole life, and when old Samuel finally died, Morgan just kept on working. I don't think he knows how to do anything else." "He seems lonely," Victoria said, surprising herself by speaking the observation out loud. "He is lonely," Martha agreed. "But he's a good man. Never causes trouble, always pays his debts, treats women with respect. In a town like this, that counts for something." Victoria thought about Morgan's quiet presence, the way he seemed to take up space without demanding attention, the loneliness in his eyes that matched her own. She thought about him more than she meant to, which frightened her. She hadn't come to Shoshone looking for connection. She'd come looking for solitude, for safety, for the absence of the kind of entanglement that left bruises. But life rarely cared what you were looking for. A month after Victoria arrived in Shoshone, a late summer storm rolled over the mountains and battered the town with rain and lightning. The restaurant cleared early as people hurried home before the weather worsened. Victoria was wiping down tables when the door opened and Morgan stepped inside, dripping wet. "Sorry," he said. "I was hoping to wait out the worst of it before heading back to the ranch." "Sit wherever you like," Martha called from the kitchen. "I've got coffee on and some leftover pie." Morgan took his usual table. Victoria brought coffee and a generous slice of apple pie, then busied herself with closing up tasks, acutely aware of his presence in the quiet restaurant. Thunder rumbled overhead. Rain hammered against the windows. Martha emerged from the kitchen with her shawl. "I'm heading home before this gets worse," she announced. "Victoria, lock up when you're done. Morgan, see that she gets back to the boarding house safely, will you?" "I don't like the idea of her walking alone in this weather." Before either of them could respond, Martha was gone, the door swinging shut behind her with the air of someone who'd just maneuvered exactly the situation she'd intended. Victoria stood awkwardly with a dishcloth in her hands. Morgan concentrated on his pie with suddenly intense focus. The silence stretched between them, filled with rain and thunder and the awareness of being alone together. "I don't mind walking alone," Victoria finally said. "You don't have to trouble yourself." Morgan looked up, met her eyes. "It's not trouble. The rain's not letting up anyway. Might as well wait it out together." She poured herself a cup of coffee and, after a moment's hesitation, sat at the table across from him. It felt strange and slightly dangerous, this simple act of sitting, of choosing to be in someone's presence rather than serving them and moving on. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked, because the silence felt too heavy to leave unfilled. "All my life, I suppose. My father bought the land when I was 5. We built it from nothing, him and me." Morgan's voice was quiet, reflective. "He died 2 years back, left me the whole operation. That must be hard, managing it alone." "Hard's relative, it's what I know." He took a sip of coffee. "What about you? What brought you to Shoshone?" The question was gentle but direct. Victoria felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to deflect, to lie, to protect herself with fiction. But something about Morgan's quiet presence, the way he'd revealed his own loneliness, made her want to offer truth, even if only a sliver of it. "I needed a new start," she said carefully. "The life I had before wasn't good for me." Morgan nodded slowly, his eyes on his coffee cup. "Sometimes a person needs to walk away from what's killing them." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Victoria felt something in her chest crack open, just a little, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. "Yes," she said quietly. "Sometimes they do." They sat in the dimming light of the restaurant, listening to the rain, and Victoria realized this was the first real conversation she'd had since arriving in Shoshone. Maybe the first real conversation she'd had in years. With Thomas, everything had been walking on eggshells, measuring words, trying not to provoke. This felt different, safe somehow in a way she'd almost forgotten existed. "Tell me about your horses," she said, and Morgan's face lit up in a way that transformed him. He talked about his breeding program, the bloodlines he was developing, the satisfaction of training a young horse and watching it realize its potential. He talked about the land, the way the seasons changed the work, the particular quality of sunrise over the Sawtooth Mountains. He talked with passion and knowledge, and Victoria listened, drawn in by his obvious love for what he did. When the rain finally lightened to a drizzle, Morgan walked her back to the boarding house, keeping a respectful distance between them. On Mrs. Henderson's porch, he tipped his hat. "Thank you for the conversation," he said. "I don't get much chance for that." "Neither do I," Victoria admitted. Something passed between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement of loneliness meeting loneliness. Then Morgan was walking away into the wet night, and Victoria was climbing the stairs to her small room, carrying the warmth of connection like a candle flame cupped in her hands. After that night, things shifted between them in small, almost imperceptible ways. Morgan still came to the restaurant 3 times a week, but now when Victoria brought his food, they exchanged a few words beyond the transactional. He asked how her day had been. She asked about the ranch. Nothing deep, nothing probing, just the small threads of familiarity that people weave between themselves when they're testing whether connection is possible. Victoria found herself looking forward to his visits, which terrified her. She'd spent the last 6 years of her life learning that men were dangerous, that marriage was a trap, that trusting someone with power over you was the fastest way to get hurt. Thomas had courted her so sweetly, had seemed so kind, and then 3 months after their wedding the first slap had come, and by the end she'd been living in a nightmare of calculated violence and desperate survival. She couldn't go through that again. Wouldn't survive it if she did. But Morgan wasn't Thomas. She could see that, even through her fear. Morgan was quiet where Thomas had been loud, gentle where Thomas had been rough. He kept his distance, respected her space, never pushed for more than she was willing to give. The loneliness in his eyes spoke of isolation, not cruelty. Still, Victoria kept her guard up, watching for the signs she'd learned to recognize. The flash of temper, the need to control, the way a man's voice could go cold before his hands went hard. She watched for them in Morgan and didn't find them, which only made her more cautious because Thomas had been good at hiding too, at first. September arrived with cooler temperatures and changing leaves. The restaurant settled into the rhythm of harvest season, feeding the men who worked the nearby farms and ranches. Victoria had been in Shoshone for 6 weeks and had saved almost $40, a small fortune that represented independence, the ability to move on if she needed to. One afternoon, Morgan came into the restaurant outside his usual schedule. He looked uncertain, his hat in his hands. "Victoria," he said when she approached, "I was wondering if I could ask you something." Her heart jumped, fear and something else tangled together. "What is it?" "I've got a problem at the ranch. My cook quit last week to get married, and I've been trying to manage on my own, but I'm burning everything. I was wondering if you might be willing to come out on your day off and teach me some basics. I'd pay you, of course, $1 for the afternoon." It was such an unexpected request that Victoria almost laughed. "You want me to teach you to cook? I can manage bacon and coffee, but beyond that, I'm hopeless. My father believed cooking was women's work and never taught me properly." Morgan looked embarrassed. "I know it's an imposition, but I'm desperate, and Martha said you're a good cook." The logical answer was no. Going to an isolated ranch with a man she barely knew was exactly the kind of risk Victoria had come to Shoshone to avoid. But something in Morgan's genuine embarrassment, the way he stood there asking for help with something so domestic and unthreatening, made her consider. "When?" she heard herself ask. "This Sunday, if you're free. I could pick you up in the morning, have you back by evening." Victoria thought about her Sundays, spent mostly in her room reading borrowed books and avoiding interaction. She thought about the $40 in her carpet bag, enough to run if she needed to. She thought about the way healing sometimes meant taking small risks, testing whether the world held anything besides danger. "All right," she said, "but I need to be back by 6. Relief washed over Morgan's face. "Thank you. I'll be here Sunday at 8. Sunday dawned clear and cool, the kind of September morning that promised summer would eventually yield to fall. Victoria, dressed in her most practical skirt and blouse, braided her dark hair and waited on the boarding house porch. Her ribs had healed completely now, the bruises faded to nothing, but she still caught herself moving carefully, protecting herself from blows that no longer came. Morgan arrived precisely at 8, driving a wagon pulled by a handsome bay horse. He helped her onto the seat, careful not to touch her more than necessary, and they headed north out of Shoshone. The ride took about 40 minutes, following a rutted track through rangeland dotted with cattle and horses. Morgan pointed out landmarks, talked about the land, kept up an easy stream of conversation that didn't require much response. Victoria relaxed incrementally, soothed by the familiar rhythm of hoofbeats and the vast openness of the Idaho landscape. The ranch came into view gradually. A simple but well-maintained house, a large barn, several corrals filled with horses, all set against the backdrop of distant mountains. It was beautiful in an austere way, and Victoria could see immediately how much work went into maintaining it. "This is all yours?" she asked. 2,000 acres, most of it's grazing land, but the horses are what I really care about. Morgan pulled the wagon up to the house. "Come on, I'll show you the kitchen." The house was neat but obviously lacking a woman's touch, functional furniture, clean but sparse. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, clearly designed by someone who understood cooking even if Morgan himself didn't. "My mother planned this kitchen," Morgan said, watching Victoria examine the stove and work surfaces. "She died when I was 12, but she loved to cook. My father never let me learn, said it would make me soft." There was old pain in his voice, the kind that came from a childhood shaped by rigid expectations. Victoria understood that pain intimately. She'd grown up in a household where her father had valued obedience above all else, where her mother had taught her that a woman's role was to submit and endure. She'd married Thomas believing that was simply how life was supposed to be. "Show me what supplies you have," she said gently. They spent the next several hours in the kitchen. Victoria taught Morgan basic techniques, how to properly fry eggs, make biscuits from scratch, roast meat without turning it to leather. He was an attentive student, focused and careful, asking questions and taking mental notes. He also made her laugh when he accidentally dumped too much salt in the biscuit dough and they had to start over. "I'm hopeless," he said, but he was smiling, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "You're learning," Victoria corrected. "That's different." They ate lunch together at his kitchen table, biscuits and gravy that Morgan had made mostly himself. Victoria felt something strange and unfamiliar settling in her chest. Contentment, maybe. Peace. The simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone whose company she enjoyed. After lunch, Morgan insisted on showing her the horses. They walked out to the corrals where 24 animals grazed or dozed in the afternoon sun. Morgan leaned on the fence, pointing out bloodlines and characteristics, and Victoria watched the way his whole demeanor softened when he talked about his horses. A young mare approached the fence, curious. Morgan produced an apple from his pocket and offered it on his flat palm. The horse took it delicately and he stroked her neck with obvious affection. "This is Willow," he said. "She's 2 years old, just started under saddle. Smartest horse I've ever worked with." Victoria reached out tentatively, let Willow sniff her hand, then touched the soft nose. The horse's dark eyes were gentle, trusting. Something about that trust, the way Willow leaned into Morgan's touch without fear, made Victoria's throat tight. "You're good with them," she said. "Horses are honest. They don't lie about what they're feeling. If you treat them right, they give you everything they have." Morgan glanced at her, something thoughtful in his expression. "I've always found that easier than dealing with people." "People are complicated," Victoria agreed quietly. "Yeah." Morgan was silent for a moment, then said, "I'm not good at this, at talking, but I want you to know that I appreciate you coming out here today. It's nice having company. The ranch gets lonely sometimes." Victoria understood that loneliness bone deep. "The town gets lonely too, even with people around." "I suppose it does." Morgan studied her face, careful, respectful. "Can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if you don't want to." Victoria tensed, readying herself for intrusive questions, for the probing she'd been dreading. "That first day you came to the restaurant, you looked like someone who'd been running hard and was scared to stop. I recognized it because I see the same thing in horses sometimes, when they've been handled rough. I guess I want to know if you're safe now. If there's anything chasing you that I should know about." The question was so gentle, so clearly coming from concern rather than nosiness, that Victoria felt her carefully maintained walls crack a little further. She looked out over the rangeland at the mountains beyond, anywhere but at Morgan's too perceptive eyes. "I had a husband," she said finally. "He hurt me. I left. He's not chasing me because he doesn't know where I went, and the people who do know are glad I'm gone." The bare facts, stripped of all the terror and pain and desperate nights. "So yes, I'm safe now, as safe as I can be." Morgan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm glad you got away. That took courage." "It took desperation," Victoria corrected. "Courage would have been leaving earlier, still counts." Morgan straightened from the fence. "For what it's worth, you're safe here. On my land, in my presence, you're safe. I give you my word on that." Victoria looked at him then, at his honest face and steady eyes, and chose to believe him. It was a small act of faith, but it felt enormous. The afternoon stretched long and golden. Morgan showed her more of the ranch, introduced her to his 2 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse and handled the day-to-day cattle work. They were older men, weathered and polite, who called her madam and didn't ask questions. Then Morgan and Victoria walked back to the house as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. "I should get you back to town," Morgan said, but he sounded reluctant. "I suppose so." Victoria was reluctant too, which surprised her. She'd enjoyed today more than she'd expected, had felt more like herself than she had in years. On the drive back to Shoshone, with the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Morgan said, "Would you want to do this again? Come out to the ranch, I mean." Not necessarily for cooking lessons, just for company. Victoria's first instinct was to say no, to retreat behind the walls she'd built for protection. But something stronger than fear made her say, "I'd like that." Morgan's smile was worth the risk. After that Sunday, a pattern developed. Victoria would spend her day off at Morgan's ranch, and they'd cook together, care for the horses, walk the land, and talk. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing the kinds of stories people tell when they're learning to trust each other. Morgan told her about growing up under his father's harsh expectations, about the relief and guilt he'd felt when the old man finally died. Victoria told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about her father's gambling debts and her mother's quiet despair, about how marriage to Thomas had seemed like escape, until it became another kind of prison. She told him things she'd never told anyone, and he listened without judgment, offering understanding instead of pity. In turn, his stories revealed a man who'd been shaped by loneliness and hard work, who'd learned to find satisfaction in solitude because he'd never expected connection. They were both damaged in their ways, both carrying scars, but somehow together the damage seemed less defining. October arrived with frost in the mornings and the first snow dusting the mountain peaks. Victoria had been in Shoshone for 3 months and had saved almost $100. She no longer thought of it as escape money. The fear that had driven her west had slowly transformed into something quieter, more manageable. She still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at sudden movements, but the constant hyper-vigilance had eased. She was healing, she realized. Slowly, incrementally, like ice melting in spring. And Morgan was part of that healing with his quiet presence and patient understanding, his willingness to let her set the pace of their growing friendship. Because it was friendship, Victoria told herself. Just friendship. The fact that her heart jumped when she saw his wagon coming down the street, that she counted the days until Sunday, that she lay awake thinking about the sound of his laugh, that was just because he was the first person in years who treated her with genuine kindness. It definitely wasn't love. She wouldn't let it be love. Love was dangerous. Love gave people power to hurt you, but then came the day that changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon in late October, the restaurant crowded with the lunch rush. Victoria was carrying a tray of dishes when a man in a dusty suit coat grabbed her wrist as she passed his table. Not hard, not threatening, just trying to get her attention. But the sudden grip triggered something primal in Victoria's nervous system, a flashback to Thomas's hands on her, and she dropped the tray, plates shattered. Food splattered across the floor. The restaurant went silent. Victoria stood frozen, her breath coming in short gasps, her vision tunneling. She was back in that kitchen in St. Louis, Thomas's hand around her wrist, his other hand drawing back to strike. Then Morgan was there. He'd been at his corner table and crossed the room in seconds. He positioned himself between Victoria and the startled customer, blocking her from view, giving her space to breathe. "It's all right," he said quietly, not touching her, just being present. "You're safe. It's all right." Martha appeared with a broom. The customer stammered apologies, clearly mortified. Other diners went back to their meals, the moment passing. But Victoria couldn't stop shaking, couldn't push past the panic that had grabbed her by the throat. "Come on," Morgan said gently. "Let's get you outside." He guided her out the back door into the alley behind the restaurant, still not touching her, just providing direction. In the cool October air, Victoria leaned against the wall and tried to remember how to breathe properly. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm sorry, that was stupid, he barely touched me." "Don't apologize." Morgan's voice was firm. "Whatever you lived through, it left marks. That's not your fault." Victoria pressed her palms against the rough wood of the building, using the physical sensation to ground herself. Gradually, her breathing slowed, her vision cleared. The panic receded, leaving embarrassment in its wake. "Everyone saw me fall apart," she said miserably. "Everyone saw you have a human reaction to something that scared you." Morgan leaned against the opposite wall, giving her space. "Victoria, there's no shame in being affected by trauma." She looked at him through tear-blurred eyes. He was watching her with such compassion, such understanding, that something in her chest cracked wide open. All the walls she'd built, all the defenses she'd maintained, suddenly seemed exhausting and unnecessary. "I'm so tired of being broken," she whispered. "You're not broken." Morgan's voice was quiet but certain. "You're healing. That's different. Healing is messy and hard, and sometimes it means falling apart in restaurants. But it's still healing." Victoria wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe that healing was possible, that she could be more than the sum of her trauma, that there was a version of herself on the other side of this pain. "I don't know how to stop being afraid," she admitted. "You don't have to stop being afraid all at once. You just have to be a little less afraid each day. Let people help you. Let yourself feel things besides fear." Morgan paused, then said carefully, "Let yourself trust that not everyone will hurt you." He was talking about himself, Victoria realized. He was asking, without directly asking, if she could trust him, if she could see him as more than just a kind acquaintance. "I do trust you," she said, the words coming from somewhere deep and honest. "You scare me because I trust you, and I don't know how to trust someone without giving them power to destroy me." "I don't want power over you," Morgan said quietly. "I just want to be someone you feel safe with." Victoria studied his face, this man who'd shown her nothing but patience and respect, who'd given her space to heal without pushing for more. She thought about the Sundays at his ranch, the easy companionship, the way he made her laugh. She thought about how alive she felt in his presence, how the world seemed less gray and more full of possibility. "I do feel safe with you," she said. "That's the terrifying part." Something shifted in Morgan's expression, hope and tenderness mixed together. "It doesn't have to be terrifying. We can take this as slow as you need. I'm not going anywhere." "You say that now," Victoria said, old fear making her voice bitter. "But eventually you'll want more than I can give, and then where will we be? Where do you think I'll want that you can't give?" The question stumped her because she'd been expecting him to deny wanting anything, to reassure her with comfortable lies. Instead, he was asking her to articulate her fears. "Everything," she said helplessly. "Marriage, intimacy, trust, a future. All the things I'm too damaged to offer." Morgan pushed off the wall, took a step closer but still kept distance between them. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to really hear it. I don't want you despite your damage. I want you, Victoria Vaughn, exactly as you are right now. Scared and healing and doing your best to put yourself back together. That's who I see. That's who I want to be around. If you eventually want marriage or intimacy or a future, that would be wonderful. But if all you can offer right now is Sunday afternoons and conversations over dinner, that's enough. You're enough." Victoria felt tears spill over, but for once they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of something she'd almost forgotten existed: relief. The profound relief of being seen and accepted, damage and all. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "How to let someone in." "Neither do I, really. We'll figure it out together." Morgan finally crossed the space between them, moving slowly enough that she could stop him if she wanted. "Can I hug you? You look like you could use one, but only if you want." Victoria nodded, and then Morgan's arms were around her, careful and warm. She stiffened for a moment, instinct warring with desire, then slowly relaxed into the embrace. He held her like something precious but not fragile, supporting but not imprisoning. It was the first time a man had held her without demanding anything in return, and she hadn't realized how much she needed it until it happened. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "For what?" "For being patient, for seeing me, for helping me remember that good people exist." Morgan's arms tightened slightly. "Thank you for trusting me enough to try." They stood in that alley for several minutes, holding each other while the world moved on around them. When they finally separated, Victoria felt lighter, like she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying for years. "I should get back to work," she said. "Will you be all right?" "I think so." She managed a smile. "Sunday, wouldn't miss it." After that day, something fundamental shifted between Victoria and Morgan. There was an acknowledgement now, an understanding that they were more than friends, that they were moving toward something neither of them had quite named yet. Morgan continued to be patient, letting Victoria set the pace, but there was a new tenderness in how they interacted. He'd touch her hand in passing. She'd lean against him when they sat watching the sunset. Small intimacies, carefully negotiated, teaching Victoria that touch could be gentle and wanted. The first time Morgan kissed her, it was early November, the first real snow falling on the ranch. They'd spent the afternoon in the barn, and he was walking her back to the wagon when Victoria stopped to catch snowflakes on her palm. When she looked up, he was watching her with such open affection that her breath caught. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, always asking, always giving her choice. Victoria's heart hammered with fear and desire in equal measure. But she'd been practicing bravery in small doses, so she said, "Yes." Morgan cupped her face in his calloused hands, gentle as handling something precious, and kissed her softly. It was nothing like Thomas's demanding, possessive kisses. This was a question asked and answered, a sharing rather than a taking. Victoria's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady under her palms. When they separated, both slightly breathless, Morgan rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that for a while," he admitted. "Me too," Victoria said, surprising herself with the truth. "I was just too scared to admit it." Still scared, she considered. A little. But the good kind of scared, the kind that means something matters. "You matter," Morgan said firmly. "To me, you matter more than anything." Victoria kissed him again, taking the initiative this time, claiming this intimacy as something she wanted rather than something done to her. Morgan responded with careful passion, mindful of her boundaries, letting her control the depth and duration. When they finally climbed into the wagon, Victoria's lips were tender and her heart was full of cautious hope. They courted through the winter, if a relationship between two damaged people could be called courting. They spent Sundays together, sometimes at the ranch, sometimes just walking around Shoshone. Morgan would come to the restaurant and linger after his meal, talking to Victoria during the quiet periods. He brought her small gifts, never anything expensive or presumptuous, just things that showed he paid attention. A book she'd mentioned wanting to read. A warm shawl when the weather turned bitter. A jar of honey from a local beekeeper. Victoria learned the rhythms of Morgan's life, the demands of ranching in winter, the way he worried about his horses in the cold. She learned that he sang off-key when he was working alone and thought no one could hear. That he had a scar on his left shoulder from being thrown by a horse at 15. That he read poetry at night, though he'd never admit it in public. that his loneliness ran so deep he'd convinced himself he didn't need anyone, right up until the moment he'd met her. She learned that love, when it was healthy, looked nothing like what she'd experienced with Thomas. Love was patient. Love was kind. Love respected boundaries and celebrated small victories, and didn't demand more than you could give. Love was Morgan reading beside her in comfortable silence. Love was him understanding when she needed space and being there when she needed presence. By the time February arrived, Victoria had been in Shoshone for 7 months and couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The town had become home in a way St. Louis never had. She'd made friends. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house had become almost maternal, checking on Victoria and sometimes leaving treats in her room. Martha had taught her more about cooking and often sought her opinion on restaurant decisions. The other townspeople had accepted her without question, giving her the anonymity she'd craved and the community she'd needed. And there was Morgan, constant as the mountains, helping her piece herself back together one day at a time. On Valentine's Day, he took her to dinner at the restaurant after it closed, an arrangement he'd made with Martha. The tables were cleared except for one in the center, covered with a white cloth and set with candles. Martha had left food warming on the stove and made herself scarce. "This is beautiful," Victoria said, touched by the effort. "You deserve beautiful things," Morgan said simply. "I wanted to do something special." They ate Martha's excellent roast chicken and potatoes, and Morgan talked nervously about nothing in particular. Victoria could tell he was working up to something, and her heart beat faster with anticipation and residual fear. Finally, after they'd finished eating, Morgan reached across the table and took her hand. "Victoria, I need to tell you something, and I'm probably going to do it badly because I'm not good with words, but I need you to know that I love you. I've loved you for months now, probably since that first Sunday you came to the ranch and taught me how to make biscuits. I love your strength and your courage and the way you're fighting to heal. I love how you are with the horses and how you laugh at my terrible jokes. I love everything about you." Victoria felt tears gathering. "Morgan, wait, let me finish." He squeezed her hand. "I know you're not ready for marriage or big commitments, and that's all right. I'm not asking for anything except to keep doing what we're doing. Keep spending time together. Keep learning each other. Keep building something good between us. But I needed you to know that I love you, and I'm not going anywhere, and whatever pace you need to take, I'm willing to match it." Victoria had spent the last several months learning to identify her emotions, to distinguish between the fear that warned of danger and the fear that simply meant something mattered. Right now, sitting across from Morgan in the candlelight, she felt both kinds of fear. But she also felt something stronger. "I love you too," she said, the words coming easier than she'd expected. "I've been too scared to say it, but I do. I love you, Morgan Ashford. I love your patience and your kindness and the way you make me feel safe. I love how you are with your horses and how you see the good in people. I love the life you're helping me build, one Sunday at a time." Morgan's face transformed with joy. He came around the table, pulled her to her feet, and kissed her with a passion carefully controlled. Victoria kissed him back, pouring all her healing and hope and love into the connection. They stood in the empty restaurant, holding each other, and for the first time since arriving in Shoshone, Victoria allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a happy future. Spring came to Idaho territory with wildflowers and new foals. Victoria had been in Shoshone for nearly a year, and the town felt like home in her bones. She'd saved over $200 now, not as escape money but as security, as proof that she could stand on her own feet. She'd learned to trust her own strength, learned that healing wasn't linear but was still possible, and she'd learned that love, when it was right, didn't diminish you. It expanded you. Morgan had been talking about hiring another ranch hand to help with the spring work, which meant more income, which meant the ranch was doing well. Victoria had been thinking about what came next for them, what their relationship could become if she could push past the last of her fear. One Sunday in early May, she arrived at the ranch to find Morgan waiting with 2 horses saddled. "Thought we'd ride out to the north pasture," he said. "There's something I want to show you." They rode for about an hour, following creeks swollen with snowmelt, crossing meadows carpeted in wildflowers. The day was warm and perfect, the kind of day that made you grateful to be alive. Finally, they crested a ridge and Morgan pulled his horse to a stop. Below them, a valley stretched out, green and lush, with a creek running through it and a stand of aspens at the far end. It was beautiful, isolated, perfect. "This is my favorite part of the ranch," Morgan said. "I used to come here when I was young, when my father was being particularly difficult. I'd sit and imagine a different life, a better life." He turned to look at Victoria. "I've been thinking about building a new house here. Something bigger than the current place, with a real kitchen and a porch facing the mountains. A house meant for a family, not just a man living alone." Victoria's heart was racing. She knew what he was asking, what this moment meant. "I know we talked about taking things slow," Morgan continued. "And I meant that. But it's been over a year since you came to Shoshone, Victoria. You've done so much healing, grown so much stronger, and I want to build a future with you if you're ready. If you think you could be happy here on this land with me, I'm asking you to marry me. Not because I want to own you or control you or any of the things your first husband did, but because I want to build a life together, a partnership, a home where you always feel safe and loved." He dismounted and helped her down, then pulled a simple gold band from his pocket. "Not fancy or expensive, just honest and real. This was my mother's ring," he said. "The only thing of hers I kept. I know it's not much, but it feels right, offering you something from the woman who taught me what real love looks like before she was gone." Victoria looked at the ring, at Morgan's hopeful face, at the valley spread out before them. A year ago, the idea of remarrying would have been unthinkable. The scars Thomas had left had been too fresh, too deep, but Morgan had shown her that not all men were cruel. That partnership could be about mutual support rather than domination. That love could heal instead of harm. She was still scared. Probably always would be a little. But she'd learned that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite the fear, choosing hope over safety. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you." Morgan's whoop of joy startled the horses. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around, both of them laughing. When he set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. "I promise you'll always be safe with me," he said seriously. "I promise I'll spend every day earning your trust. I promise that our marriage will be a partnership, that your voice will matter as much as mine, that I will never, ever raise a hand to you in anger." "I know," Victoria said, and she did. "I trust you, Morgan. I love you, and I'm ready to start building that future." They kissed on that ridgeline overlooking the valley that would someday hold their home, sealing promises made with hope and love. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Shoshone. Martha and Mrs. Henderson stood as witnesses. Most of the town turned out, celebrating the union of 2 people who'd both been so lonely and now had found each other. Victoria wore a simple blue dress, and Morgan wore his best suit, and when they exchanged vows, Victoria's voice was steady and sure. The promises she made were the same words countless couples had spoken before them, but they meant something different after everything she'd survived. To have and to hold, to love and to cherish. She could make those promises now because she knew Morgan understood what they truly meant. Partnership, respect, choosing each other every day. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the restaurant. The whole town ate and drank and wished them well. Victoria stood beside her new husband and felt the weight of community surrounding them, supporting them. These people had welcomed her when she'd arrived broken and desperate. They'd given her space to heal and were now celebrating her new beginning. As the sun set and the celebration wound down, Morgan drove them back to the ranch, to their home now together. Victoria felt nervous but not afraid, a crucial difference she'd learned to recognize. The ranch house looked welcoming in the twilight. Morgan helped her down from the wagon, but instead of leading her inside, he paused. "I want you to know something," he said. "Tonight, tomorrow, next month, whenever you're ready. There's no rush, no expectations. This is your home. You're safe here always. We'll build our marriage at whatever pace you need." Victoria's eyes stung with grateful tears. This was why she'd been able to say yes, why she'd been able to take this leap. Because Morgan understood that healing wasn't finished just because you said vows. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, gathering her courage, she said, "But I'm ready. Not because I think I have to be, but because I want to be. I want to be your wife in every way, Morgan. I want to start this next chapter." Morgan kissed her softly. "Then let's go inside and start our life together." Their wedding night was tender and patient, Morgan reading every signal, stopping to make sure she was all right, treating her with a reverence that made Victoria want to weep. This was what intimacy was supposed to be, she realized. A sharing, not a taking. A conversation between two people who cared about each other's well-being. When Morgan held her afterward, she felt safe and cherished and whole in a way she'd never experienced before. "I love you," she said into the darkness of their bedroom. "I love you too," Morgan replied. "Thank you for trusting me with your heart. Thank you for helping me remember I had one." The next year unfolded like a gift Victoria had never expected to receive. She moved permanently to the ranch, transforming the house into a real home. She planted a garden, filling the yard with vegetables and herbs and flowers. She learned to help with the horses, discovering she had a natural way with the young ones. She took over the ranch's bookkeeping, her neat handwriting filling ledgers with records of income and expenses. Morgan proved every day that his wedding promises had been genuine. He consulted her on every major decision. He split the household work equally, never expecting her to serve him. When she had nightmares about Thomas, he held her and waited patiently for the fear to pass. When she needed space, he gave it without making her feel guilty. They built a partnership, a real marriage of equals, and Victoria bloomed in the safety of it. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, planning the future. They hired an architect and began designing the house Morgan had envisioned, the one they'd build in the valley. They talked about children, maybe, someday, when Victoria felt ready. They talked about expanding the horse breeding program, about buying adjacent land, about all the years stretching ahead of them. Victoria still worked 2 days a week at Martha's restaurant, keeping that connection to town and maintaining her own income. The money went into a joint account she and Morgan shared, but having it made her feel capable and independent in a way that mattered. Morgan understood that without her needing to explain it. By the time autumn rolled around again, Victoria had been in Shoshone for 18 months, married for a year. She was 26 years old and finally felt like she was living the life she was meant to have. The nightmares came less frequently now. The flinching had mostly stopped. She could be touched without tensing, could disagree with Morgan without fear of retaliation, could take up space in her own life without apologizing for it. One October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the aspens turn gold, Victoria took Morgan's hand. "I've been thinking," she said. "About children." Morgan went very still. They talked about this in abstract terms but never seriously, both of them understanding that Victoria needed to heal more before taking on that responsibility. "What about them?" he asked carefully. "I think I'm ready," Victoria said. "Not immediately, but soon. I think I'm in a place where I could be a mother without passing on all my damage. I think we could raise a child who knows what healthy love looks like." Morgan turned to face her fully. "Are you sure?" "There's no rush, Victoria. I meant what I said about being patient." "I know you did. But I'm not saying this because I think you're waiting or expecting it. I'm saying it because I want it. I want to create life with you. I want to raise children on this land and teach them to be kind and strong. I want to build a family with you, Morgan. A real one, nothing like what either of us grew up with." Morgan pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. "Then let's build that family. Let's build everything we never thought we could have." "Together," Victoria said. "Together," Morgan agreed. The following spring, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. The realization filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She'd watched what pregnancy and childbirth did to women, how vulnerable it made them, how much trust it required. But when she told Morgan, his reaction dissolved her fears. He cried, holding her carefully as though she was already fragile. "We're going to be parents," he whispered. "You're going to be such a good mother." "You'll be a wonderful father," Victoria replied. "Nothing like yours." "Nothing like either of ours," Morgan agreed. "We'll do better." "We'll be better." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Victoria continued working at the restaurant until she began showing, then switched to helping Martha with bookkeeping and planning. She spent her days at the ranch, preparing a nursery, reading everything she could about childbirth and infant care. Morgan was attentive but not smothering, helping where he could but respecting her autonomy. Mrs. Henderson came out to the ranch regularly, bringing supplies and advice and maternal warmth. Martha sent food. The whole town seemed invested in the coming baby, their happiness for Morgan and Victoria genuine and generous. In December, with snow falling softly outside, Victoria went into labor. It was long and difficult, the kind of labor that tested every ounce of her strength. Morgan stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, encouraging her, being the partner she needed. Mrs. Henderson and the doctor from Shoshone guided her through it. After 15 hours, Victoria gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Morgan cried when the doctor placed their son in his arms, this tiny, perfect human they'd created together. "He's beautiful," Morgan whispered. "You're amazing. You did so well." Victoria, exhausted and overwhelmed, reached for her baby. The infant's eyes were dark and unfocused, his tiny hands waving. He was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, and holding him, Victoria felt the last pieces of her broken heart knit back together. "What should we name him?" Morgan asked. They discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Victoria knew exactly what felt right. "Samuel," she said. "After your father, but we'll give him a different legacy. We'll make that name mean something good." Morgan's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Samuel Ashford, I like that. A fresh start for an old name." Little Samuel was a good baby, healthy and alert. Victoria discovered that motherhood came more naturally than she'd feared. Yes, she was tired and overwhelmed and sometimes doubted herself, but the love she felt for her son was uncomplicated and pure. This tiny person depended on her completely, and instead of feeling trapped, she felt honored. Morgan was a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor with Samuel when he fussed at night, never acting like childcare was beneath him. He sang to their son, the same off-key lullabies his mother had sung to him. He built toys and planned for a future where Samuel would learn to ride and work the ranch and grow into a good man. The years that followed were full and rich. Samuel grew into a bright, curious toddler with his father's eyes and his mother's determination. Construction on the new house began. A beautiful home rising in the valley Morgan had shown Victoria that day he proposed. The horse breeding program flourished, Morgan's reputation for quality stock spreading throughout Idaho territory and beyond. Victoria continued to heal in the layers that healing required. Some days were harder than others, old wounds aching like broken bones in cold weather. But Morgan was always there, steady and patient, reminding her how far she'd come. When Samuel was 3, Victoria became pregnant again. This time, she was less afraid, more confident in her ability to handle what was coming. Their daughter arrived on a warm July day in 1883, squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect. They named her Rose after the wild roses that grew along the creek. The new house was finished that autumn, and they moved in with their 2 children, filling the rooms with laughter and life. It was everything Morgan had envisioned and more, a home built on love and healing, a place where their children would grow up knowing safety and respect and affection. On Victoria's 30th birthday, Morgan gave her a leather-bound journal. "For writing down your story," he explained. "So our children will know where they came from, what you survived, how strong their mother is." Victoria ran her fingers over the smooth leather, considering. She'd spent years trying to forget her past, to outrun the memories of Thomas and that life in St. Louis. But maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe her story, as painful as it was, had value. Maybe someday Samuel and Rose would need to know that healing was possible, that broken things could be made whole. That night, after the children were asleep, Victoria opened the journal and began to write. She wrote about growing up in St. Louis, about the naive girl who'd married a charming man and learned too late what he really was. She wrote about the years of abuse, the final desperate escape, the long journey west. She wrote about arriving in Shoshone broken and afraid, about meeting a lonely cowboy who'd shown her what love could be when it was healthy. She wrote about healing, about how it wasn't a straight line from broken to whole, but a messy, complicated process of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. She wrote about choosing trust despite fear, about learning that vulnerability wasn't weakness, about the profound courage required to let someone in after you'd been hurt so badly. She wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes grew heavy, and when she finally closed the journal, she felt lighter. The past was still there, still part of her, but it no longer defined her. She was Victoria Ashford now, wife and mother and rancher, a woman who'd survived hell and built heaven on the other side. Morgan found her on the porch, watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling all right. He asked, settling beside her. "Better than all right," Victoria said. "I was just thinking about how different my life is from what I expected, how much better it turned out." "You made it better," Morgan said. "You did the hard work of healing, of choosing hope." "I just provided a safe place for that to happen." "You did more than that," Victoria corrected. "You showed me what love could be. You were patient when I needed patience and pushed when I needed pushing. You saw me at my worst and loved me anyway." "Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done," Morgan said simply. "Easiest and best." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, surrounded by the life they'd built together. Inside, their children slept peacefully. Around them, the ranch stretched out under the stars. 2,000 acres of possibility and promise. Victoria thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 5 years ago, bruised and broken and convinced she'd never be whole again. She wished she could go back and tell that woman what was waiting for her. Not that the healing would be easy or quick, but that it was possible. That she'd find a man who treated her with respect and kindness. That she'd have children who grew up knowing only love. That she'd build a life so full and rich that the past would become just a shadow instead of the whole landscape. "Thank you," she said to Morgan, not for the first time and certainly not the last. "For what? For seeing me. For waiting for me. For loving me back to life." Morgan raised her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles. "Thank you for having the courage to accept that love, for trusting me with your heart, for building this beautiful life with me." The years continued to unfold in their predictable, miraculous way. Samuel grew tall and serious, inheriting his father's way with horses and his mother's careful kindness. Rose was bright and bold, asking endless questions about everything, unafraid in the way children are when they've never known fear. 2 more children followed, another son and daughter, filling the house with noise and joy and the beautiful chaos of family life. The ranch prospered under Morgan and Victoria's partnership. They hired more hands, expanded the horse program, bought adjacent land when it became available. Morgan's reputation as a breeder grew, people traveling from across the territory to purchase his horses. Victoria managed the business side, her neat ledgers tracking their growth from year to year. Shoshone grew too, transforming from a small frontier town to an established community. The railroad came through, bringing more people and opportunities. New businesses opened. The school expanded. Life became less wild and more settled, though the vast Idaho landscape maintained its austere beauty. Victoria stayed connected to the town, helping Martha at the restaurant occasionally, serving on the school board, becoming someone the community respected and valued. The woman who'd arrived friendless and desperate had become a pillar of the town, known for her generosity and wisdom. She never told anyone except Morgan the full truth of her past. Most people assumed she was a widow who'd remarried, and Victoria let them believe it. The details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the life she'd built, the person she'd become, the family she'd raised with love and intention. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Morgan took Victoria back to the ridge where he'd proposed. The house they'd built dominated the valley below, smoke rising from its chimneys, children visible in the yard. It was a warm spring day, and wildflowers carpeted the meadows just as they had a decade before. "I wanted to bring you here," Morgan said, "to remind us both of where we started, of the promises we made." "You've kept every single one," Victoria said softly. "So have you. You promised to build a life with me, to trust me with your healing, to be my partner. And you have been, every single day." Victoria leaned against her husband, this man who'd saved her by refusing to save her, who'd given her space to find her own strength. "I never thought I could be this happy," she admitted. "When I left St. Louis, I wasn't looking for happiness. I was just looking for survival." "And you found both," Morgan said. "You survived, and then you found a way to live really live. That takes such courage, Victoria. I'm so proud of the woman you've become. I couldn't have done it without you. Maybe, but you did most of the work yourself. I just held space for it." They stood on that ridge, watching their children play in the distance, and Victoria felt profound gratitude for the winding path that had brought her here. Yes, there had been pain and trauma and years of suffering. But those experiences had made her who she was, had taught her the value of genuine love, had given her the perspective to appreciate what she had. She wouldn't wish her past on anyone, but she wouldn't trade her present for anything either. The children grew and eventually started lives of their own. Samuel became a rancher like his father, taking over more of the operation as Morgan aged. Rose married a teacher and stayed in Shoshone, raising her own family close by. The younger children found their own paths, but all of them remained connected to the land and to each other, bound by the love that had shaped them. Victoria and Morgan grew old together on the ranch they'd built. They watched grandchildren arrive and fill the house with new life. They saw Idaho Territory become a state. They weathered droughts and harsh winters and the ordinary challenges of a long life together. Through it all, their love remained steady. It had been forged in the crucible of healing, built on a foundation of respect and patience and genuine partnership. It was the kind of love that deepened over time rather than fading, that grew richer with every shared experience, every challenge overcome together. On their 40th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered for a celebration. The house was full of laughter and food and music. Victoria, now 64 and still beautiful in Morgan's eyes, stood on the porch watching her family with fierce joy. Morgan found her there, as he always did, drawn to her side like a compass to north. "Happy anniversary," he said, pulling her close. 40 years, Victoria marveled. "Can you believe it? Some days yes, some days no. Mostly I just feel grateful for every single one of them." Victoria kissed him, this man who'd given her the world by simply giving her space to heal. "I love you, Morgan Ashford. Thank you for showing me that love could be beautiful instead of brutal. Thank you for patience and kindness and 40 years of partnership. Thank you for everything." "I love you too," Morgan said. "And I'd do it all again, every moment, every challenge." "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Victoria. You and the life we built together." They stood together on their porch, surrounded by family, looking out over the land they'd stewarded for decades. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Inside, their grandchildren were laughing. Behind them, 40 years of memories filled every room of the house. Victoria Vaughn had arrived in Shoshone broken by life, convinced she'd never be whole again. Morgan Ashford had been a lonely cowboy, resigned to a life of isolation. Together, they'd shown each other what healing could be. They'd built a love story in the Wild West, messy and complicated and absolutely real. They'd created a family, a legacy, a life worth living. And on that porch, with her husband's arms around her and her family's laughter filling the air, Victoria knew that every hard mile she'd traveled had been worth it to arrive here. She'd survived the darkness and found her way to light. She'd been broken and made herself whole. She'd lost everything and built something beautiful from the ruins. This was healing, she thought. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of love strong enough to hold them. Not forgetting the past, but building a future so rich and full that the past became just one chapter in a much larger story. And what a story it had been. What a beautiful, heartbreaking, triumphant story. Victoria wouldn't have changed a word of it. The sun dipped below the mountains, and Morgan led her back inside to their family, to their life, to the love that had saved them both. Behind them, the Idaho sky blazed with color, and the land stretched out eternal and magnificent, holding all the stories of broken people made whole, of lonely souls finding each other, of love conquering fear one careful day at a time. And in that house on that ranch in that wild and beautiful place, Victoria and Morgan Ashford lived out their days in peace and partnership, a testament to the healing power of patient love, to the courage required for trust, to the profound beauty of building a life with someone who sees you, truly sees you, and loves you anyway. Their story became family legend, passed down through generations. The children told their children about the grandmother who'd arrived in Shoshone with nothing and built everything. About the grandfather who'd understood that true strength lay in gentleness. About a love story that had started with healing and grown into something extraordinary. And every time the story was told, the message remained the same: that broken things could be mended, that healing was possible, that love, when it was real and true and patient, could transform everything. That sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we find the courage to turn the page on the painful ones. That we all deserve to be loved well, to be treated with kindness, to build lives that honor our worth. Victoria and Morgan's legacy lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch that still stood strong, in the town of Shoshone that remembered them fondly. But most importantly, it lived on in the simple truth they'd proven with their lives, that no matter how broken you arrive, you can still build something beautiful, that healing is always possible. That love, real love, never asks you to be less than you are, but helps you become more than you ever imagined you could be. And so their story ended as all the best stories do, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet contentment, with two people who'd found each other against all odds and built a life of meaning and purpose and deep, abiding love. They'd started as strangers, become friends, fallen in love, and spent 40 years showing each other and their children what partnership could be when it was rooted in respect and watered with patience. Victoria Vaughn Ashford died peacefully at 72, surrounded by family, holding Morgan's hand as she'd held it for 5 decades. Morgan followed her 3 years later, the loneliness that had defined his early life returning only in her absence. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the valley, the mountains standing eternal witness to the love they'd shared. Their children maintained the ranch, honoring their parents' legacy. The house remained in the family for generations, each new occupant aware of the love story that had birthed it. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the sawtooths and the wind whispered through the aspens, it seemed possible to feel their presence still, two souls who'd found healing in each other's company and built something that death itself couldn't diminish. That was how their story ended, not with tragedy or loose threads, but with completion, with lives well lived and love well given, with the satisfaction of knowing they'd taken their broken pieces and created something whole and beautiful and lasting. It was, in every way that mattered, a happy ending, the kind earned through courage and patience and the willingness to believe that better days were possible even when darkness seemed absolute. And in Shoshone, Idaho, their story became legend, proof that the Wild West held room for all kinds of stories, including ones about healing and hope, and the transformative power of love offered freely to hearts brave enough to accept it.